Welcome back to the Agentic Insider. I'm your host, Philip Swan. In this show, we explore cutting-edge ideas and trends in AI and data, as well as hear from other industry thought leaders in the AI space. This podcast is brought to you by Iridius AI, committed to safe and responsible AI innovation. Let's dig in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of the Agentic Insider. I'm joined with our co-host, Alistair Lowe-Norris, the Chief Responsible AI Officer at Iridius. And today's guest is somebody really special, somebody I've only known for a couple of years, but I feel like I've known for a very long time. He's one of Forbes' top 30 thinkers, redefining leadership. He's a leadership who's all about solving for the future. And he's the co-host and co-producer of the Tomorrow Summit. And more importantly, he is the author of Autonomous Transformation, which is an amazing book. And if anybody hasn't read it yet, you should pick it up and read it. And CEO of the Future Solving Company, Brian Evergreen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Philip. Thank you, Alistair. It's great to be here.
Great. So let's just turn the question around. That you're the CEO of the Future Solving Company. So what future are you solving for then?
I love it. Thank you. You know, I have to say, I think that's the first time I've been asked that question, which is surprising. And so what I'd say to that is that I'm solving for a future where, well, first and foremost, a more human future, I would say, would be the ultimate goal. And the near-term future that I think is necessary is that I think that most people that I meet, most people that are going about their job day to day, leaders, executives, middle managers, people that are up and coming, I think most of them want the future to be better than it is today. They want to make the world a better place. They're all sort of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, at least in some capacity, right? They want to leave things better than they found them. So that near-term future I'm solving for right now is giving all of those people the tools and frameworks that they would need to be able to do that at scale across entire Fortune 500 organizations or even markets, but also even if it's down to within an individual team or even for one person. The more, for me, the way I measure that impact is am I equipping people and empowering them with the tools and frameworks that will help them to create the better future that they want to create.
That's awesome. So going into your background just a little bit, I'm always inspired by people like yourselves. I mean, what inspired you to begin your journey in this space?
In AI specifically?
Yeah.
So I was at Accenture when I made the decision to get into AI, and I was working on a project where I was in a strategy capacity, and the project was around analytics, and I felt we were doing some research on the number of jobs and number of data scientists that were going to be needed. And I felt like, okay, this seems like it's a really important, interesting space. And at least at the time at Accenture, it felt like fairly nascent in terms of, sure, there was leadership already at the C-level and stuff like that for an analytics practice. But when I looked around the local office that I worked in, there were not a lot of people that were focused on analytics compared to change management or program management or sales and all these other things, right? So that's what really, I think, sparked the journey. And then it was really a domino effect. Then I took Andrew Ng's course on Coursera and just felt like the more I learned, the more passionate I got, the more excited that I got. And then a number of years later, I joined Microsoft as the US AI strategy lead, and the rest was history.
Wow, there you go. So what early experiences in that with Accenture and Microsoft, or challenges help shape that, your current approach to where you are today?
So I got really lucky, especially, Accenture, I really cut my teeth on, how to run a program and how to do research and how to, so many fun foundational skills. And then at Microsoft, I got thrown, and actually also Accenture, I learned how to write software. I learned how to lead analytics projects. But at Microsoft, it was very fortunate. I was thrown into you both have worked at Microsoft. You may have experienced this as well. I was thrown into the deep end with Fortune 500 C-suite execs. Like week 2, I was on a flight going to meet with a C-suite team. And I hadn't created a framework for that. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to borrow from, Kellogg or Wharton or Columbia or these other schools. I'm going to borrow from whatever other frameworks exist within Microsoft and playbooks. And what I found was that again, it was very fortunate because it's just the right timing. If it had been 5 years later, right, there would have been enough thought leadership developed in the space, but it was at a time when things were nascent enough that, and people were still having the sort of, and I think we're still going through sort of the digital transformation hangover, as I like to call it, where people are still thinking through the lens of digital transformation and they're trying to make AI fit into that playbook, and it just does not fit. And so I saw that, I guess, early and firsthand with large organizations, C-suite teams, and then realized, okay, and as again, because of the purview I had and the fact that I could reach out to any professor from any organization and say, I'm so-and-so from Microsoft, and most of them would get back to me. I got a chance to really do a broad research and read across what exists already that can be helpful, where are the gaps. And then at one point I decided, from a practical reason, I started filling the gaps and creating new frameworks that we used at Microsoft with our client or customers. And then over time, I realized, I should write a book about that. I was just sharing it on LinkedIn, and then Wiley said, do you want to write a book? And then again, that was another rest is history moment, right?
So, it's pivotal, thinking about pivotal moments. So was there any pivotal moment or breakthrough moment? We all have breakthroughs during our careers, and our breakthroughs there. Is there any one that you can point to that you go like, holy crap, if I didn't have this, I wouldn't be where I am today?
Oh, there's many. I mean, the fact that, so when I first got hired into Accenture in the very first place, I was a music theory and composition major who had no business trying to get hired into Accenture, right? I mean, I didn't really, I built an education company. We were in 400 schools. So it's like I had some basic business acumen, but I thought at the time, analytics was something Google had to tell you how many people had visited your website. Like that was my knowledge, right? And so, so that was someone took a risk on me, and that was pivotal. But I'd say probably the most pivotal for what I'm doing today was when I went, in order to have enough time and mental space to finish my book. I went to Norway and I stayed in a fishing cabin that had been that up in the Arctic Circle. There's a ring of islands, and they have these fishing cabins that have been modernized, and they're very nice. And I went and stayed basically when in the off season, when there's like, a couple hundred other people and they're all residents, right? Like there's not a lot of tourists there. There was one coffee shop that was open till 3 p.m. that I went to every day just to be around other humans. And then I think there was maybe one restaurant nearby. And so I remember sitting in that coffee shop and having this moment, because I'd been working on the book and already had some of the different, ideas that led up to, right. And I knew there was a reason to be writing this, but I had this moment where it clicked for me that systems thinking and strategy was the biggest. And for me, in my own personal arc, having grown up as a chess player competitively, it all clicked that like, this is a really important moment for me to double down, and I have to carve out and create a new system that does not exist yet. And that's when I came up with the reason driven strategy. Not all exactly that moment, but that sparked that, right? And that led me down, and that's been a big part of my work.
Yeah. So for everybody's edification, Brian is actually a chess grandmaster. He's absolutely amazing.
Not a grandmaster though. I don't want to correct you, Philip, but I was among the top ranked 12-year-olds when I retired from chess, but I didn't make it to grandmaster. Just to be.
Got it. Okay, I thought you actually had become grandmaster.
No, I was trained by grandmasters, but I was not. I didn't make it to grandmaster.
So I want to explore this a little bit more. So you talked earlier about digital transformation and everyone trying to see it from the lens where trying to take AI through the lens of digital transformation, because it's what they've known for the past decade or so. So how do you see emerging, technologies like AI, altering those traditional business models, and from your perspective?
Great question. So I would say that the way that to me, what I think digital transformation, I'm curious if you agree, was saying, let's take the value that we already are creating in the world. Let's create it exponentially more efficiently than we're creating it today. And sometimes, on a very rare occasion, like Netflix, are we actually introducing an entirely new way to deliver that value that actually shakes up and creates new markets. But for most organizations, we deliver this widget. Now we can deliver it X% more quickly and at a lower cost, or maybe it's the same cost to the customer, but we have better margins, right?
We took a process, or we took every process in a company and we digitized the hell out of it. And at the end of it, we ended up with a very digitized and faster way of building widgets. But at the end of it, we hadn't changed anything transformative with the business. There was less transformation going on. There was mostly digitization.
Yes, and I actually call that, because I created a 2x2 in the book, where I added, so there's digital transformation, but then I wanted people to be able to bucket all the initiatives that aren't transformative. And if you start with the definition of improving something without changing the nature of it or the structure of it, you actually get the word reformation, which is interesting, because I think for most of us, we think of reformation as a Protestant Reformation, right? Or political reformation, right? And so, but the true definition of reformation is to improve something without changing the nature of it. And so technically all those initiatives that you just described are digital reformation. And so to your question around, how it's changing, I think that I recently wrote an article that was published in VentureBeat, where we had a 3-circle Venn diagram. The big giant circle that encompassed the other two was total addressable value creation for organizations. The amount of value that you as an organization can create, that you can transact upon, that your market, your customers, your partners would be thrilled. Okay, yes, we will pay you money for that. That's addressable value. A much smaller circle within that is an amount that is currently being addressed by any given organization today. You've never maxed out all the value you could create, right? But you're doing a certain amount today with a combination of people and processes and AI maybe already, and other system automation, RPA, et cetera. And then there's this other circle, which is addressable by AI agents. And that circle very narrowly overlaps with the current processes being run by organizations. But the biggest part of that is new value creation that you couldn't do before. It's like you've been painting in, we've discovered a new kind of paint, a new color altogether. And so rather than saying, let's repaint every painting that we've already painted with this new color, instead you can create entirely new things. And so that's, to me, the way that, from a systems thinking and zooming all the way out and thinking, oh, right now we're creating this amount of value, rather than picking that up and saying, how can we do it better or faster with AI and with agents? Instead saying, we get to go back to the basics and say, what is the core value proposition, core competencies, core expertise that we bring to the market? And now that we have this entirely new set of systems, how can we add exponentially more value and essentially increasing our organizational GDP? You don't increase GDP by limiting the number of people in your country. You just increase the output, right? And I think that's important for organizational leaders to think through.
That's a really great point.
It is, and I think that it's very easy for people to see. I walk into my home and the lights come on. That's a process. It's digitized. You could put an agent on that, but that's not in itself doing much more than the reformation approach. To your point, there are so many things that can be done if you're using intelligent autonomous learning, agents that go way beyond what we've ever had the opportunity to do before. And if you take the approach that you're able to collaborate with them, okay, and treat them that way, okay, then there's an opportunity here to be able to do something really great and really increase, as you say, the GDP from a company perspective. Absolutely.
Totally agree with you, though I am pretty cautious about the word collaborate, because I think that especially for people, like we're all familiar with AI systems, right? From our backgrounds.
Right.
And so that's been our job, right? And so when someone tells us to collaborate with an AI system, we would approach that knowing that it's not actually a collaborator. It's just a system, like a really advanced calculator that we're inputting, information into, and it's spitting something back, but that is not actually thinking, understanding, on the other end of that, right? And so, but for a lot of people that don't have a background in AI, when they're being told collaborate with AI, treat it as a coworker, I think that can be harmful more than it's helpful. I think, to me, I think especially for enterprise grade AI, it's less about individual collaboration with AI and more about systems thinking, because you're effectively creating a system that's going to take action and maybe make decisions on your behalf. And so you have to think through, what are those actions? What are those boundaries that I need to set? And then, and to me, that's less about building a relation, because to me, I would only collaborate with someone if I'm trying to build a relationship with them. But if you're building a relationship with a system, if I knew ahead of time I was collaborating, let's say there's somebody in a different time zone, and we decide, you know what, we're never going to have a meeting. I'm just going to write all the instructions of what I'm going to need you to do. I feel like that's more what's happening with AI agents. You're never building any kind of real rapport with it. You're writing out the instructions of what you need it to do, and you're tuning or developing the system to be able to do that. But you're not technically collaborating. Maybe I might be being too semantic in that. But
I don't think you are, and I think it depends on the horizon that we're talking about here as well, in that respect. And I think as in the future, depending on how far out it is, to have something like, take Star Trek with commander data on the Enterprise or similar like that, then that's these virtual. I mean, that's right. I mean, OpenAI is about to release virtual employees to go in that will communicate, talk, okay, and chat with people and so on. But you're right. It depends on what the level of that collaboration is. And if you're going into it with a desire to build up a relationship and a rapport, then it really depends on, it's not the sort of thing that people go into a relationship with AI to be able to do. They treat it much more as a system, as you say, to be able to do it. And I think then that's that collaboration, is a very different nuance, okay, than you would with a human being at this point. Absolutely.
Which opens up a whole new can of worms on safe and responsible AI and how you do all of this responsibly, right? And that was it. So, Brian, can you share an example of where an innovative solution that you are being working on that perhaps even not involving AI, doesn't have to involve AI, that has exceeded expectations, and what factors contributed to that success?
So there is a company that is architecting a multi-billion dollar, two-figure billion-dollar moonshot that basically they decided, okay, it's a moonshot, right? We're trying to make a market. We're trying to do something we've never done before. And it would be unscientific for us to assume that we can use data and the data-driven methodology to prove in advance how long it'll take, how much it'll cost, and whether or not it'll work. Because we're doing something new. That if the newer the thing is, the more there's no data to prove anything about it. And the more you're basically, I like to call it commissioning expeditions into the unknown, right? If there was a new mountain discovered, right, that was in the fog before we could just fly over like today, imagine, and you don't necessarily, you can't prove in advance whether or not there's anything worth getting to on the other side or at the top or whatever. You just have to decide whether or not it's worth it to send an expedition up into the fog to figure out if there's something there. And that's essentially when you're doing real innovation, that's what you're doing. I think organizations get stuck on, I don't want to bet my whole farm and end up, to running out of funds because of it, experimentation and innovation. So the answer to that is don't bet more than you can afford to bet on experimentation. But if you're trying to prove in advance that it's not an experiment when it's something new for you, even if someone else has already done it, it's still new for you, new for your context, new for your experts. And so it'd be wrong to assume that you actually know how much it's going to cost. It actually likely end up costing more by making that assumption than if you do controlled sets of experiments. And so this organization, they're a Fortune, I think 25 company, and they're doing essentially a moonshot that has to do with autonomy, and they started with that goal in mind of what is it that we want to achieve, and then the question, what would have to be true. And for those who aren't familiar with the reason-driven framework, it starts with that goal you're trying to achieve. You ask what would have to be true, and the first sets of answers to those questions are theories of things that would have to be true. And then for each theory, you ask the question again, what would have to be true for that theory to be true? And you have hypotheses, and you keep going until you get to the bottom where all the answers to things that would have to be true are already true. And now, unlike OKRs or some of these other sort of, I would say, incomplete methodologies where you're picking a goal and you're picking a couple steps between here and the goal, but you're not mapping the whole thing. You're not mapping all the unknowns that you would need to consider. But this gave them the opportunity to do that. And then to also say, of some of the things that would have to be true, we can look at out of the market and see that the National Science Foundation is already investing in proving or disproving that hypothesis. And we can see when they're planning to have that answer based on the grant that they gave. So we're just going to monitor that one and set up an alert to remind us to go check it out when it's supposed to be done. Whereas over here, we need to partner with a tech vendor. Over here, we partner with an OEM supplier or whatever it might be. But having the full strategy that then they can bring to other folks in their leadership team and say, this is what we're trying to achieve. We've all agreed on that goal. We've documented what we think would have to be true. So now we're talking about logic and reason, and we can have that conversation and align on that before we start talking about numbers of how much individual projects cost. But I think most organizations get stuck where the strategy is almost hidden, right? Where there's not really a visual strategy. And then you're flattening. You might have done 3 months of prep before this exec review, but all it gets flattened down to is like, here's a paragraph and a set of numbers. And if somebody doesn't like that numbers, they're going to shoot it down, even though it might be a very important step between where you are and where you really all agree you would want to go, because it's not normally visualized as this is a step on the path that we're going to have to figure out one way or the other. It'll get shut down, shelved, and you'll have to bring it up when there's, a reorg or whatever, and maybe, right?
So we actually implement a reason-driven framework here at the Iridius. That's exactly what we do, is like what has to be true, and do the work back plans from there.
Oh, that's one of my favorite things to hear. I love it.
Right. So we are very much protagonists of the reason-driven framework here. And so what kind of business results do you have you witnessed from implementing this?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the biggest ones is that the success rate for complex initiatives. The statistics a few years ago, and I think that the most recent reports I've seen are always somewhere in the 80s for failure rates for AI initiatives, right? And so the organizations where I've had, because I really stood out in this journey post Microsoft 2 years ago. So, and some of these initiatives are very long. So there's many that are currently in flight, but the ones that have completed, the feedback that we've seen so far against the ones that have been completed versus the ones that failed, et cetera, is that this framework, because the thing I often tell organizations is what the reason that 80% of those things fail isn't the technology. It isn't because the people trying to do it aren't smart. It's not even because they were not coming at it, approaching it in a smart way. It's not because they weren't working hard enough, right? We get outcome bias and we try to figure out, okay, it's because you didn't plan it well enough, or it's because you didn't execute it well enough, and we point fingers. When truly, I think it's the system that they're using that's the problem. And that if we fix the system, you keep the same smart people, they work just as hard, and oh my goodness, it works better. And so that's what I've been seeing, is that organizations have seen dramatic, where it's essentially the flip, right? Where the main reason something didn't work was, because we had a part of our hypothesis of whether or not this would work, we had to prove it was true or false. Turns out that we proved that it's false, but we saved a lot of money not committing to a 3-year research timeline to prove that it's false, and instead doing smaller, more controlled experiments.
Because one of the things that we've found in implementing the reason-driven framework here is that we also have to hold each other accountable. And it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO, one of the other founders, or anybody in our organizations. We challenge each other, because excellence doesn't come from one person. Exceptional comes from a team working together and delivering exceptional outcomes.
I love that you just said that. I was on a call just before this, actually, with someone where I was explaining that that from a systems thinking perspective, and I try not to be too nerdy about systems thinking. It's one of my favorite topics, but so often we get stuck in organizations measuring our own either personal performance or our team's performance or even our department's performance, when the success of the overall system is not the sum of the performance of the individual parts of that system. It's actually the sum of the interactions between them, right? And so to your point, like what you just described is a perfect example where you could be absolutely killing it at your role, Phillip, and you, Alistair, could be 100 out of 100. But if the interaction between those two things isn't, that's actually the most important measure. If there's a one there, it wouldn't matter that you're both performing at the top of your game. It'd actually be better to reduce your individual performances if it raised the collective performance, which is so hard for us to think about. But I always say, imagine Beyonce singing in a choir. She has to reduce her individual performance for the overall for the choir to sound good. Otherwise, there'd be this glaring difference between her skill and strength of her voice versus the rest.
Absolutely. So when you think about the reason-driven framework and think about, the fact that every change that an organization has to go through, and coming from a change background, there's an understanding that resistance is natural. Okay, we're going to expect it to. Nobody really comes to work and goes, you know what I want is more change in my life. Okay, and so they're looking to be able to understand that resistance is natural. It's a risk you need to be able to mitigate. And so, when you're thinking these things through, when you're dealing with sort of agentic systems or AI systems, that there are going to be challenges. That there are going to be setbacks that are going to come from a whole host of different things, especially from user adoption, but not least from those areas. Okay, how do you think about how to be able to mitigate and overcome those, and probably be more planful in that? And what's your perspective there?
Great. I love that question. It's so important. I agree that so few people, I can't always relate to the idea of not enjoying. I don't like change for change's sake, right? It probably drives anyone nuts, right? But being able to, for me, doing something new and interesting and exciting is something I've always enjoyed. But I hear your point, and I think that a lot of people do struggle with that. So what I would say is that your effectiveness of your strategy will only be as effective as your ability to, one, articulate it in a way that people can understand, and not just what it is or why it's important, but what it will mean for them, right? And that's, I think, where there's a huge breakdown for so many organizations. Is they have a great strategy that's going to drive a lot of profit, but if they don't answer the question of what is the future of work when we reach this goal that we talked about, what will your different individual impacts and jobs look like? How are we going to retrain you for these new category of jobs we're going to create, et cetera? If you don't do that work and you just say, we're going to do this thing because it's going to be really great for the company and good for our customers, it leaves them to wonder, how is that going to impact me? And as you both know, because you're both ex-Microsoft folks, I'm sure we've learned from Joe Whittinghill, uncertainty is, we feel uncertainty in the same part of our brain as physical pain. We experience it as physical pain. And so that's, I think, a big part of the breakdown for a lot of AI initiatives is not giving clarity. Clarity is kind, right? We always say. And so being able to give clarity on what are we doing, why are we doing it, what will it mean for you, what are we asking of you to do, and how does that tie into the core kind of agreement and social contract and legal and all the other contracts between us as employees and employer. And so I think for me, the vehicle of storytelling, I think a lot of times it was seen in the 1900s, which feels weird to say it like it's a long time ago. In the 20th century, storytelling was seen as extra credit for a lot of leaders, because it's like you can do command and control, and people can't leave because they don't know any other place they can go get a job unless they happen to be in New York City or Silicon Valley. Whereas now with the internet, people can leave anytime they want. That system of leadership doesn't work anymore. You can't do command and control the same way. And so I think that storytelling becomes core competency, where actually understanding, and the predecessor to good storytelling is empathy, understanding what is it that I want this person to believe or know about what we're doing that will motivate them to want to be a part of it. What do I think and understand about what they currently think about it? And where's that gap? And what do they need to see data? Do they need reassurances? Do they need, what do they, how do I bring this to them in a way that will motivate them and excite them even? And I think a lot of times we miss that part, and then you could have the best vision and the best strategy in the world, and it'll still fail because you forgot the storytelling part.
And I think this is crucial. It feels like there's we're using the storytelling, and I love they're explaining this, but using the storytelling allows you really to do a balance between the excitement of the innovation and also an understanding and an acknowledgement of the risks that it's going to bring and the impacts on the people from it, coming from a root of empathy.
That's right.
I know that one thing that we share in common, because we've talked about it several times in the past, Brian, is that AI is not to replace humans, right? The AI, it's about augmenting humans. And one of the things that we are seeing in our experience at Iridius, why so many AIs projects fail and get out of R&D, is going back to not selecting the right use case in the beginning, because everybody thinks, well, I can just make an AI for this. I can agentify that.
Yes.
Are you seeing similar things? It's a lot to do with the use case as well.
Yes, I'm so glad. Yeah, I don't know if you knew you were bringing up one of my favorite rants, but here we go. So
There we go.
So I think that I always say use cases are the friend of engineering and the enemy of strategy, because it basically, for a lot of people, they want to skip the hard work. They don't want to put on the overalls and do the hard work. They're looking for a quick, easy button. Pilots, use cases, low hanging fruit is the quick, easy button to feel like you're making momentum without having to actually go through the process of thinking through and doing strategy and creating a vision and all of that, right? You could just say, let's just start with some use cases. And the equivalent to that for me would be if you said, I always make people go through this exercise. So we're going to do it together with your podcast listeners. Okay. So you don't literally have to close your eyes, but if you were to close your eyes and imagine the most beautiful building that you've ever been inside of, and really take it in, right? For me, it's one of them is, a gorgeous cathedral with like high, right? Like the Notre Dame, let's say, right?
That was mine. That's my favorite building in the world.
Gorgeous, right? Yeah. And it makes you feel small, and it's, right. So, which was the intent, of course. So, but now I want you to imagine how they came together when they came together to plan to build the Notre Dame, since we're on that example. Do you think that that conversation with that there's the architect that's in the room, and there's the builders, maybe the head, the equivalent of a general contractor, I don't know what they called it back then, but there's these leaders coming together. Do you think they said, well, what, which tools are we going to use? Well, we're going to use a hammer, we're going to use a saw, we're going to use, let's start with a couple hammer use cases and see where it goes from there. Like, it's laughable to think that we would end up with a Notre Dame. Similarly, when we say, let's just upskill everybody on AI and then we'll go through a transformation, that's like telling everybody in Paris, in this case, let's upskill everybody in Paris on hammers, and then we're going to have Notre Dame. When actually, no, you first have to have a bold vision of what you want to do and what value you're going to create, and what building, and the example, but for your organization, what value you're going to create, and then work backwards and say, well, what would have to be true for us to create that value? If at the point where they were designing and building, planning for the Notre Dame, the tools came at the very, very, very end, right? The tools inform what you're capable of building, but you don't start with the tool and say, how are we going to use this to make the building that we want to make? You start with the vision for what you want to create. So I think that I always say use cases are the friend of engineering, but the enemy of strategy. And that when someone says, let's just pick a good use case, that's a kind of cosign. That's like a sub language for, I don't want to do the hard work. I just want an easy starting point. The problem is, this is not an area where you can just have an easy starting point and really get transformational value. So if you're okay with incremental improvements and maintaining status quo, great. Go for some use cases,
These use cases are coming out of much lower in the org. They want to be able to do a microcosm of innovation, if we would call it that, okay, and push things forward. But they are not the people at the top who are setting the ultimate strategy. And because there isn't having that conversation, there's nothing coming down from the top. They're trying to build it up from the bottom, and then there's not going to be a groundswell to be able to your point, to be able to get a cathedral out of all of these individual microcosm initiatives.
That's right. It's a systemic issue where if true transformation, I don't think can be a grounds up. Even the examples where we talk about like humanocracy, if you remember Gary Hamel's work, the leadership made a decision to democratize more of the way that sub-organizations were leading and making decisions and innovating. But that was still a tops up. That didn't happen because of the bottoms up. It was not a bottoms up decision. The top leadership made that decision, and then it rolled out. And I think unfortunately, it's the same for organizations. And so some of it has to do with, are you in a systemic context? If you're more junior, where that transformation can take place. And if it can't, you have to decide if you, and it's no easy decision because people have families relying on them. And but you have to decide, okay, do I want to maintain the status quo of this organization? And is the current salary and work style and everything else worth it to me? Or if I really want to be a part of something transformative, do I need to go somewhere else? And what sort of organization is fostering that, where that is a top, like a board level agenda item that's actually being executed well, that I want to, line up and be a part of.
Awesome. So going into some industry myths and misconceptions, because this is a world full of hype and BS, as we all know, right? In so many ways, right? What is one common misconception from your perspective that you'd love to debunk here?
Oh boy, one? I only get one?
You can get 3.
Okay, number 1, AGI is never coming. Number 2, no. So, I mean, yes, I do think that about AGI, but that's a much deeper, longer conversation. So, probably one of the biggest ones that has to do with strategy is that I think that well, there's 3 that you said 3, but the 3 I usually go after is I when I have like I'm speaking at a dinner or something, and they give me 15 minutes for remarks. I say, if you go to any given conference, the average advice you're going to hear, panels are going to mutually kind of agree and nod and feel like they sound smart when they say, I don't mean that in a rude way, just, it does sound smart, which is start with what problem you want to solve, be data driven, and pick some good use cases. I've already sort of shared my perspective on use cases. I think I've shared about why being data driven is unscientific. And so then the last one is the problem you want to solve. And I think it's natural. We've inherited a mindset from the Industrial Revolution all the way back to Taylorism, right? 1911, Frederick Taylor, first ever management consultant, wrote this book called Principles of Scientific Management. I know you gentlemen probably know this, but just for the benefit of the listeners, that where he said in the past, the system or the human has been first. He said man, but the past, the human has been first. In the future, the system must be first. And frankly, I think he succeeded in him and the rest of the movement, right? Where now most organizations are system first, people second. And so I think we need to flip that. And it needs to be in the past, in the future, the system, the human must be first and the system must be, must be second. And so, and not only because of what that means from a values perspective, which is where I started, but I've later learned, that's actually why so many of these organizations are failing, is that they're taking the same mechanistic, like they're treating the organization like a mechanical system when it's actually a social system of humans, that those social forces of relationships and contracts are tearing down your success because people don't agree with what you're doing or they're not behind it in some way. And so, so problem solving is one of those inheritances from that, where when you have a mechanical system, you look for the problems, you eliminate them, and the mechanical system works better. Continue to improve it over and over and over again. But future solving, right? The idea of saying, let's move beyond starting with what problems we're going to solve, because that always narrows the field of vision to incremental improvements. And instead saying, what future do we actually want to be in? If we forget about the current, and then Bell Labs did this in the 50s, where they said, he said that there's a long story there that's fun that I wrote about in the book, but he essentially said, imagine that Bell Labs was gone, like all the entire telephonic system of the United States was crashed and it could not be repaired. And we had to start from scratch with everything we now know, all the technology that's available within the current regulatory environment. Okay, go, right? They still had their operational responsibilities, but they did regular exercises of envisioning what it should be, and then asking what would have to be true to get there. And that through that process, they developed the underlying groundwork for cellular technology, the touch tone phone. Like there's so many, like the majority of the breakthroughs we had in the 20th century came from that single moment where that person said, basically, we need to stop solving, because before then, all the main innovations that they had that got them decorated as the most, innovative industrial lab had been invented in the 19th century, but implemented throughout the first 50 years of the 20th century. And he made a joke where he said, what in the world have all you been doing? All these things were invented before you even got here, essentially, right? Some of you before you're even born. And so that's the issue, is that as organizations, we naturally take on the custodianship of the existing value and inventions that were created before us. And we're trained to do that. We learn that in school. But we have to, if you want to create new value, you don't have to, but if you want to create new value and have real innovation, you have to step outside of that custodian mindset and think, what would be the best possible thing we could create, and what would have to be true to create that?
We are not data driven at Iridius. We are data informed, right? So this is where we use, and you and I bonded immediately when you started talking about that. I go like, finally, somebody's talking my language, that data doesn't drive your decisions. For God's sake, people, get the human element back, because we all know data can be wrong.
The $46 billion loss in the metaverse that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta had was a data-driven decision. The data said that was a worthwhile. Buying Jack Dorsey's first NFT, tweet for, I don't remember, 2.8 million or something like that, A year later,
of course.
the highest bid they could get was $280. But it was at the time, investing in NFTs was a data-driven decision. The best thing you could possibly do, right?
Absolutely. So we're coming close to the end here. Let me just hit you with one more. So after today's conversation and given everything we've been talking about, and what's a final thought that you'd like to leave with the people who are listening? Based on your book, your research, and the way that you guide people on being able to think through things.
It's a great question. I think the thing I've been learning more and more, right? Because it's interesting how when you write a book or you go out and you try to share resources and insights with the world, things you think will be the most helpful sometimes are, more interesting to you than they are to other people. And things you don't realize, oh, there's this presupposition I have about people's ideas and orientations that I need to be more direct about. And so that being that, I realize that most people don't seem to see strategy as everyone's job, and strategy is something that's inherently based in almost all knowledge work, right? There is a form of strategy where you're given a set of goals, or even if you're just prescribed, these are the goals you need to hit this year, here you go. The way that you decide the path from where you are to achieving those goals is strategy work, even if you're not calling it that. So yes, M&A is strategy, but strategy doesn't just belong to one department. Strategy is interwoven into every single day. Whether or not you choose to buy certain groceries to be stocked in your refrigerator or in your pantry, there's an element of strategy, whether you thought through it or not. You're still implementing a form of a strategy. And so I think that's one of the biggest things I've been realizing, is that a lot of people see strategy as this lofty thing when you've been doing strategy already every day in some form. And it's a skill that you can improve. Just like if you were writing JavaScript, you can learn how to write more elegant JavaScript by practicing and by learning about it. Strategy is the exact same way. And it's, to me, one of the biggest, between strategy and systems thinking are to me the number one success criteria for AI or any complex initiative that you want to achieve.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Just to finish up, beyond work, what do you do outside of work that recharges your own creativity?
Well, that was a different answer 6 years ago. I have a 6-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, and so I mean the majority, like going to the spring fair with them and going on all the carnival rides and stuff, right? Like, so that definitely recharges me. I'm the captain of bedtime, so we read 5 stories every night, and it's always fun going through and picking which stories we're going to read, and we're intentional about having breakfast together in the morning and going on adventures as often as we can in the weekend, or if I can take off work early. So honestly, they are, yeah, I feel, people sometimes talk about how kids having a family it is a trade-off in terms of time, but I see it. I don't know if either of you are into Pokemon at all, but it's, to me, I always thought I joke sometimes that having kids is like the moonstone or something. Like you evolve by having children, I think. And so, and not to say that anyone else needs to have children if they don't want to, but my personal experience is I'm a completely different human, far better for having these children that shape me and mold me and inspire me. So I would say that's the main thing I do outside of work is spend time with them and with my wife.
And one last thing, after this conversation, what's the one thought you'd like our audience to have?
The one thought I'd want them to have is that I want them to ponder is that we are in a scenario right now where I consider that there's a dearth of vision. There used to be bold, audacious visions, and a lot of what it meant to be a leader was having a bold vision. And now I think in the aftermath, or not the math, inside the math of the shareholder primacy, what it means to be a leader for public organizations often is confused with just reporting better results every quarter, and that often actually is in conflict with having a bold vision. And so the thing I would say is, what is the vision? What's the thing, whatever you're doing, whatever you're focused on, whatever your projects are, if you succeed, what will the world look like? Will it be better? And if not, I would take another look at that and think through what would have to be true for it to be for it to be better. And does that align with something that I care about? I guess because it has to come from intrinsic motivation, obviously. So
Fantastic.
But Brian Evergreen, cannot thank you enough for taking the time out of your hectic schedule. And I know how busy you are. Brian is also working closely with Snoop Dogg on some big projects. So I wish you well on that. And we look forward to participating in that at some point in the relatively near future. Brian, I urge everybody to read your book, Autonomous Transformation. Is there any other way that you would like people to reach you or look you up?
Yeah, feel free to. I'm on LinkedIn, and so that's the easiest place to connect with me. And I've got a Substack as well, but I I usually post about it on LinkedIn. So I usually tell folks that LinkedIn's the best entry point for connecting with me and learning more about what I'm up to. And if there's something, if you're an organization that could use some guidance or workshops or etc., feel free to reach out. I'm one of those DM for free LinkedIn premium members. So.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much. And thank you for your time listening to today's episode. And tune in next week for another exciting episode of Exploring Agentic Systems with the Agentic Insider. Thank you, everybody. That's a wrap on this week's episode of the Agentic Insider. Thank you for listening. For show notes and more, please visit agenticinsider.show. To learn more about Iridius, visit iridius.ai. We'll see you next time.